Over the past few weeks, the United States has repeatedly threatened the territorial integrity of a NATO ally, Greenland, part of the Kingdom of Denmark, questioned the reliability of collective defence in NATO, publicly disparaged Allied veterans, and treated international rules as conditional on national advantage. At the same time, the United States has refused to diplomatically or politically confront Russia's invasion in Ukraine in a meaningful or robust manner, thereby weakening the credibility of international law as a constraint on aggression and leaving the conflict in Ukraine without any effective enforcement mechanism. Concurrently, President Putin has openly acknowledged that Russia's campaign in Ukraine and potentially beyond is one of territorial enlargement, and whilst China continues to expand its military capabilities, conduct industrial-scale espionage and entrench Western economic dependence through manufacturing dominance and supply chain leverage. So, for decades now, the United States, supported by its allies, provided the decisive hard power that underwrote the enforcement of the international rules-based order. That alignment no longer holds. The current United States administration now operates within a policy framework not altogether dissimilar to those of Russia and China, insomuch as economic leverage and military power take precedence over legal and institutional constraint. This shift, it's a strategic global shift, compels the United Kingdom and the European states to reassess their strategic position. Reliance on the United States can no longer be assumed. Economic, security, and political dependencies are therefore having to be re-examined. For the first time since 1945, the defence of the rules-based international order is no longer led unambiguously by the United States. Europe is consequently being forced to assume a greater share of responsibility, as it should, for sustaining that order, irrespective of whether it has developed the necessary capability, cohesion, or decision-making structures required to do so. The post-war system functioned primarily because power was restrained by rules and because the Western world, by which I mean the United States supported by her allies, was prepared in the main to abide by and enforce those rules. That system has been challenged numerous times by the regimes in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, and to a lesser extent, I suppose, Pyongyang. And what has changed really now is that President Trump, in arguing that the United States must control the Western Hemisphere, is, in a practical sense, aligning with the spheres of influence concept that's been applied by those regimes. The primary enforcer of the rules now appears to be paying scant regard to the rules himself. Hence, power is now being increasingly exercised through economic leverage, coercive diplomacy, and the threat or actual use of force, with legal and institutional constraints treated as optional rather than binding. As I say, Russia and China have long operated in this way. The difference now is that their approach appears, on a selective basis, to have also been adopted by President Trump. So, what are the consequences for Europe? Europe has perhaps benefited more than any other region from the global and predictable rules-based environment. But for the last 30 years, the region has undermined itself by shifting towards managerial liberalism, compromise and consensus in the social, economic, diplomatic and military spheres. All European states have focused on soft power for decades now, or conveniently ignored the fact that soft power is fine until such time as someone comes along with a big stick and is prepared to use it. You then need an equally big stick or bigger and the willingness to use it. Ultimately, if you are reliant on rules, then you must be prepared and able to enforce them and maintain your capability to do so. But the United Kingdom and Europe have for far too long relied on the United States to fill that role. Now Washington, with its threats towards Greenland, has demonstrated that Europe can no longer rely on the United States and must now contemplate having to guard against it, the United States, instead. Europe, and Great Britain in particular, with their managerial liberalism, over-reliance on American military power, and having mistaken compromise for leadership, have become complacent. We, have neglected and therefore lost much of our agility, strategic depth, and, I would say, global influence. We have compromised on our cultural and social identity, and therefore our unity. And arguably, we've indulged in a cultural diversity that has undermined our unity and identity even further. We've become too dependent on free trade, offshoring ownership of our critical infrastructure, and have assumed institutional stability in a world that threatens all of these things. These errors already created a situation in which it is difficult for the UK and European states to make independent decisions. But the region, the European region, the Scandinavian Nordic region, if you like, in the UK, is increasingly vulnerable and could become, arguably, already is, contested space, contested by Russia militarily, China economically, and now also the United States. Europe faces a choice. It has long avoided that choice, but it is one that cannot be put off any longer. That choice is whether it is prepared to stand by the rules it depends on, or if it's not. If it is, it must also be prepared to reject further accommodation of cultural diversification, social division, and foreign ownership of its assets. We must instead build social unity, economic, industrial, and military self-sufficiency and resilience, and find in ourselves the political willingness to act with leadership instead of compromise all the time. There is no room for prevarication in all this. There is also no room for hedging bets. Diversification of trade and diplomacy is not a strong strategy, certainly not on its own. Assuming that your partners will adhere to the rules when quite patently they will not, unless it is to their advantage to do so, is a very high-risk strategy indeed. And tempting though it may be for managerial European heads of government who lack the instincts of true strategic and statesmanlike leadership to try and reduce risk by spreading it through, for example, deepening economic ties with China, this would be a very unwise step. Because to do so would simply increase the leverage those who already exploit us have over our economies. It would increase risk, not reduce it. So, the question Europe faces is not whether the rules-based order is changing, because it is. It already has done. That much is already evident. We live in a world governed increasingly by leverage and coercion, and in which Europe can no longer assume that the United States is inside the tent. The question is therefore whether the United Kingdom, Nordic states, and Europe, together perhaps with the Anglosphere, excepting the United States, are prepared, as the United States steps away from its prior role, to assume the guardianship of the rules-based order, and to do so in a climate of hard economic and military leverage that challenges those very principles. If we do indeed wish to preserve those principles, the question then is, are we prepared to sustain them materially through building the necessary capability, coordination, and credible use of economic and military hard power to defend them? Now, before answering that, it's perhaps worth considering what the alternative is. If we are unwilling to exercise example and leadership, unwilling to acknowledge the fundamental weaknesses of managerial liberalism, and unwilling to build and, if necessary, exercise hard economic and military power, our nations will themselves become increasingly contested space over which the United States, Russia, and China vie for economic, technological, and military dominance and advantage. But the central point is this: the world is changing. It is changing rapidly, and an international order that is no longer enforced will be replaced. Are we ready for that?